Hello.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Christy Jovanovic, and I'm the collection manager at Los Angeles Museum of the Holocaust. So for those of you who may not be familiar with the museum, ours is the first Holocaust museum in the United States that was founded by Holocaust survivors. Since the 1960s, our institution's mission has been to commemorate, educate, and inspire. Following the mandate of our founding survivors, our programs and admission to the museum are always free of charge. So today we're pleased to have with us Richard Wiesel, who is an Australian photographer and the creator of the project Objects from the Concentration Camps, which is currently on exhibit at the museum.
Good afternoon.
Hi, Richard.
Hey, Christy. How you doing?
I'm good. So the exhibition chronicles artifacts from the closed archives of the Ravensbrück and Sachsenhausen concentration camps, as well as the stories behind them. And the exhibit opened at the museum in January of this year. So before I hand it over to Richard, I wanted to start by talking a little bit about how the exhibit came into being at the museum. So when we first came across the proposal for the exhibition, we were immediately struck by how the photographs so clearly and poignantly focused on the individual artifacts and really used these to tell the history of the Holocaust. This is a sentiment that is very much aligned with what we do at the museum, because as a primary source-based institution, we really rely on artifacts to educate the public about the Holocaust. Hearing the stories behind artifacts really helps to humanize Holocaust history and give a face to the millions that were murdered. A number as large as 6 million can be really difficult to imagine, but when you hear about the human being behind an object, this really underlines the sadness and horrific impact the Holocaust had on humanity. So when we began to look at and discuss the curation of the exhibition, a recurring theme that emerged was that we felt it was really important to choose photographs of artifacts that belong to the victims. Often we inadvertently view the Holocaust through the lens of the perpetrators, in that so much of the documented evidence that survived the Holocaust was actually created by the Nazis. So by concentrating on photographs that depicted possessions relating to the victims, it really presented us with a unique opportunity to create a counterbalance to this. At the same time, the inclusion of a small number of images related to Nazi artifacts adds an important layer to our understanding of the various elements of this history. So now I'll hand it over to Richard to talk a bit more about this incredible project, and please feel free to post questions in the comments section, and Richard will answer some of those at the end of the presentation. Richard?
Christy, thank you. What an introduction. Fantastic. Nice to be with you. Completely social distance by about 14,000 kilometres. So I think we're doing that right. Sorry, we couldn't be doing this in the museum itself, but it is what it is, right? This journey was a very strange one, and it began literally, 21,000 kilometres away from my home in Sydney, Australia. And about 2 years ago, I was on a family holiday with my family, my children, my 2 teenage boys, and my wife in Berlin. And after doing a city tour, a number of tours, and because I have a strong interest in European history from 1900 to 1950, 55, my American Jewish gay tour guide suggested if I really wanted to go see Sachsenhausen, one of the camps, the only person to see it with is renowned historian Dr. Robert Sommer, who's based in Berlin, written a number of books. He lectures and also guides. He told me it won't be easy to get Dr. Sommer, but because I seem to be a nice guy, and we all seem to be very interested in the topic of Nazis and the Holocaust and the story element of it, I was able to connect with Robert, and Robert very generously took the 3 of us, my wife didn't come, to Sachsenhausen. And on the tour, there's so much to see, so many barracks, much has been kept. It was used by the Russians after the war as an operating base. A lot of things were not destroyed. Some were, but most were kept, and has now been completely lovingly and authentically restored and managed by the memorials themselves, who do a fantastic job, I have to say, absolutely fantastic. And talking to Dr. Sommer, I said on this tour, Robert, there's so much on display, I would imagine there'd be so much more not on display. And he said, Richard, you won't believe what is not on display. So many items, so much history, so many stories that I could tell and show you. If you come back to Germany, I can take you through the archives. We can try and get permission and go. And then the thought didn't leave me for quite a while. And then I started emailing Robert, and Robert very generously agreed to work with me on this project. And together, we have been able to curate around 80 items or artifacts. Robert would go to both Sachsenhausen Memorial and Ravensbrück, which is primarily a female and children's concentration camp, separated by about 40 kilometers on the same line going north of Berlin. And together we were able to come up with 80 items. We could have come up with 800 items that spoke volumes about the Holocaust, its impact on individuals, society, human life, and many generations since. And the very interesting thing here is that we weren't just taking, or I wasn't just taking photographs of these personal items, but while I was sitting there, Robert was working on the computer, researching each item that was, in store or had been donated. And because the Germans kept records on everything, we were able to trace each item back to its original owner and the fate of that person. And I think by doing that, Christy, it made the whole project personal, and it made it completely different to, oh, there's an item there that looks terrible. It made it relatable because all of us had a teddy bear. All of us has had a blanket. All of us had a dress. All of us had a toy. And all these things have been left behind by the victims. And it's a silent reminder from the grave, a voice from the grave telling us, hey, don't forget me. And I think that's the biggest fear. I think reading, my late cousin uncle's work, Elie Wiesel's work, and reading Viktor Frankl's work, and particularly Primo Levi's work, What is a Man? I think the biggest fear for the Holocaust victims was not so much dying, which in itself is terrible, but was really about who will remember us when we're gone, who will know who we are. And I think to be forgotten is the worst thing that could ever happen to a person, individual, community at all. So with that, I thought we might quickly jump into a real fast history on the two camps, Ravensbrück and Sachsenhausen. And then we can go through a number of images, and I can talk about the history of those images and where they came from and how we photographed them and what we did. So I want to just say that I'm indebted to Dr. Sommer for his help, indebted to the memorials of Ravensbrück and Sachsenhausen memorials for giving me access to these items that had never been seen before. And without this, and without the museum's assistance and taking this project on for an unknown artist, I'm completely humbled and grateful to the Los Angeles Holocaust Museum for hosting me. And I imagine the items, more images will be online and up until June. So if we do come out of lockdown, you do get a chance and you're in Los Angeles, please go along and see them because they are displayed in large format. And I'll talk about those in a second too. So for context, I'm just going to have to read a little bit too because there's a lot of context here. Ravensbrück was built in 1938. It runs about 80 kilometers north of Berlin. It was a concentration camp mainly for women and children inside Nazi Germany. Most of the camps were outside of Germany, interestingly enough, but Sachsenhausen and Ravensbrück were inside Germany itself and not that far from Berlin. It was also the training base for some 3.5 female SS supervisors who were then sent to other camps like Auschwitz, Belsen, Birkenau, and Ravensbrück and Sachsenhausen, and across the Nazi concentration camp system. It housed, from operation between 1939 and 1945, it housed over 132,000 women and children. I mean, that number is staggering, 132,000. And out of that, over 50,000 women and children died due to starvation, being worked to death, and medical experiments. These people were called the rabbits of Ravensbrück. and we'll talk about more about them shortly in the presentation. In early 29th and 30th of April 1945, the camp was liberated by Soviet soldiers. And on its liberation last year, Dr. Sommer and I gave a presentation at the memorial, which was a complete honour for me, on the Liberation Day, to talk about some of the images we photographed and what it meant to be working at the camp, which I will share with you shortly. Sachsenhausen was built in the summer of 1936, and it was the model camp in which all the other concentration camps were based on, which meant entryway, guard towers, lights, barracks, layout. They're all very similar to what Sachsenhausen was laid out as. It became the model camp for training and was very close to the SS training grounds themselves, pretty much right next door. And also between 1936 and 1945, some 200,000 people were imprisoned in Sachsenhausen and its satellite work camps. And most of these were supplying slave labour to the Henkel aircraft factory. The SS would rent out its concentration camp victims or people or concentration camp labour for around 2 marks to the Henkel factory to work. So if we now want to consider the actual images themselves, as I mentioned before, I think I like to look at them, and here's some images from inside the Los Angeles Holocaust Museum of my work. We should consider them that they're not really photographed, but stories. And I keep talking about these stories. I mean, they're really individual human stories that, when married to their researched histories, tell us a lot about the original owner and their fate. And it offers a silent opportunity for the victims to speak to us with their, I guess, collective voices. And in doing so, they do so with a sense of honesty and humility and possibly a warning. If we look at the images, what do they really say? Who were these people? Were they just like you and me? And on a visceral level, of course they were. They were human. They were like us. The difference is that our fate is separated by 75 years. And I wanted to sort of, when I photograph these items, I really photograph them in a very simplistic manner. I wanted to separate the object from the background, just the item itself, on a black piece of cord, black piece of paper, creche. It's almost like a curtain cloth, using one light, focused in nice and sharp onto the object, and photographed quite simply. Because the simpler the object is to me, the simpler I would imagine it is to you, and your interpretation of what you're seeing is also made easier and simpler. Too much stuff on the photograph, too much things going on in a photograph is, to me, complete visual anarchy. And we can't work with anarchy, can we? So we also wanted to display them with no glass, just on the wall with the historical research data below them, or with an easy eyesight. I did that because I wanted the viewer to get really close, almost right up to it, to touch it. You're going to kill me when I say this, but almost to touch it. Sorry, Christy. We covered it in a special coating, the fingerprints we wiped off, because I just wanted the people to get a real feel of it and get a real understanding and look at the detail that was in there. With that, let's now have a look at a few of the images, and I'll give you the history behind them. Excuse me, need a glass of water. The first one, this out of all the 80 images is the most powerful image to me. It's a teddy bear. Unlike a teddy bear that I had as a child, our children have, our grandchildren have. And I was working at Ravensbrück. We were working in what was formerly the SS garage, which was near the parade ground. It's now the memorials. It's now the memorials operations office, where they do their research and they run the memorial from. The head curator brought in the box, and inside this box was this teddy bear. We put it on the cloth, and it just absolutely made me have to stop. I think it made Robert stop. I remember looking over to Robert on his computer, and I'm looking over, I'm looking at the image, and I think we both had tears in our eyes. And we hadn't even read anything about this image yet at all. But this baby, this little teddy bear, belonged to a very small child that arrived on a Sinto-Roman gypsy transport into Ravensbrück in late 1944. While this unknown child was walking along the pathway, which Robert said to me was literally outside where we were working, it's where the storeroom was, where they put all the belongings of the victims. As they're walking into the camp, and this little boy was trying to keep up with the column of adults, he dropped his bear. When he quickly broke ranks to run back and pick up his only possession that he brought with him, his teddy bear, an SS officer saw this child do that and killed him instantly, shot him for stepping out of line without permission, and then kicked the bear to the side and left the boy where it is, assuming a prisoner would pick up the body as well, which meant nothing to the Nazis. A political prisoner, a German political prisoner, a Miss Annie Sindermann, witnessed this terrible event. And when she had a chance, when the column moved on, she scooped up the teddy bear, hid it under her dress, and basically kept the teddy bear throughout her incarceration until her liberation in Ravensbrück, which was in April 45. She donated to the memorial, this teddy bear, in 1993, and went around schools and telling people about this horrible story and about what she saw and what happened to this teddy bear. I understand the bear is now being restored and a lot of the rust has been taken away. Personally, I like it the way it is. I think it is how it was, but they've really looked after it. The memorials do really look after their artifacts deeply, and they care deeply for them. I haven't seen it since. I was hoping to see it in June this year, but when we can travel again, I look forward to going back to Ravensbrück and visiting this teddy bear. It's a very emotional teddy bear for me. In keeping with the theme of the 1 million children that were murdered by the Nazis, this beautiful dress belonged to another child that was killed in Ravensbrück, but was found in the storeroom of Ravensbrück and was given to little baby Sylvia Elizabeth, who was born in 1944 in Ravensbrück concentration camp. Her mother was a Dutch resistance fighter, Connie van Outen, who gave birth to baby Sylvia in the camp. Obviously, the life expectancy of a newborn in a concentration camp was not very long. And unfortunately, even though that Connie and all the other prisoners in barracks tried to keep baby Sylvia Elizabeth alive, she died within a few weeks of birth. Connie decided to keep this dress and hid it. And when she was liberated from another concentration camp, which was moved to Mauthausen, she returned to her home back in The Hague, where she remarried and gave birth to another girl called Miriam. When Connie did pass away in 2011, Miriam donated the dress of her elder sister that she never met to the Ravensbrück Memorial, where it's been lovingly kept and restored. It's a very beautiful piece of dress. You can see the intricacy and the detail, how it was stitched. Obviously, the child that originally owned it, the little girl, was well loved as well as baby Sylvia Elizabeth was. And it's just a reminder for us about the millions of children, the million plus children that were executed by the Nazis. Keeping the theme alive about execution and death, cyberzol ampules. In 1942, you may have heard of a prominent Nazi who was an architect of the final solution called Reinhard Heydrich. He was called the hangman of the Third Reich. In 1942, he was ambushed by Czech fighters and injured gravely by a grenade wound, an explosion, and taken to hospital. One of Hitler's personal physicians, Dr. Karl Gebhardt, Heinrich Himmler's personal physician, Karl Gebhardt, supervised the post-surgery of Reinhard Heydrich, but due to a blood infection and sepsis, Heydrich died from his infection. Gebhardt was accused of not treating Heydrich well enough and using everything he could. And he was accused of not using sulfonamide antibiotics, which the other Nazi doctors thought would have saved his life. To exonerate himself, and for no other reason, and to test the ineffectiveness of sulfonamide antibiotics, he was given permission to test this drug on a handful of female prisoners at Ravensbrück. And these prisoners were called the Rabbits of Ravensbrück. So between July of 1942 and October of 1943, Gebhardt conducted medical and surgical experiments for no other reason than to exonerate himself on these female prisoners. He would break their legs, infect them with various organisms. He would grind glass, dirt, splinters, introduce pus and other foreign objects into these women, and then try different drugs or worthless drugs on them to treat this gas gangrene, to, of course, no avail. Most of the women did pass away in severe agony. Those that did survived with massive and major deformities. During the doctor's trial in Nuremberg and during the trial for crimes of humanity, Dr. Gebhardt was found guilty for crimes against humanity and sentenced to death, and he was executed on the 2nd of June, 1948. Slide 8, urn slide. So Simone Albert was a political prisoner, and she's caught up in Hitler's 1941 order of Nacht and Nebel, which is Night and Fog Directive, which is to imprison or kill families and friends and individuals who are part of the resistance. Simone, she was born in a little French town of Thies. In May 1944, when she was 33, the Nazis deported her to Ravensbrück as a collaborator and a resistance fighter. 5 months later, as you can see on the urn, she died on the 28th of October in 1944. She was pronounced death due to natural causes, but of course we know that she died because she was starved and worked to death. The lid of this urn indicates the body was cremated 3 days after she died. The urn itself was meant to be returned to the family, where they would have had to pay probably 5 marks to the Reich to retrieve the body. Unfortunately, the body was never retrieved of Simone Albert, and her ashes, we assume, were left in the urn. All that remained of the artifact was the clay top for Simone Albert. As we said, Ravensbrück wasn't a execution concentration camp. It was a working camp. So though they starved to death and were worked to death, they were not gassed to death at that camp. So again, a terrible reminder of a life that had so much promise and was doing so much that was just taken away for no reason at all. Prisoners, of course, never had luxury of knives and forks or cutlery. When you arrived at the camp system, you were given an enamel cup similar to this or like this, and a plate perhaps, and then that was your cup to use for washing, for brushing, for eating. If you lost that cup, you didn't get another one, and you probably received no food or meager rations of the watery soup that they would give the prisoners once a day, and some Erat's coffee, which was watered down, not even coffee, coloured water. Most prisoners would tie their cup to their clothes and to their belts with strings so not to lose this cup, and that was probably their most prized and important possession within the concentration camp system. This cup in particular belonged to Renée Mirand Lavelle, who was born in 1908. Mirand Lavelle, she studied law, and at the time of the occupation of France was an active lawyer who defended members of the French resistance in court. And because of her involvement in the resistance movement, she was arrested by the Gestapo in late 1944 and deported to Ravensbrück in the same year. At the camp, she witnessed so much, and she resolved to bear witness to all the atrocities that she'd been seeing. After liberation, she became a prominent public representative of the victims of Ravensbrück and as a chairperson of the French Survivors Organization of Ravensbrück. And she tirelessly spoke of the suffering within Ravensbrück all across Europe and through Germany and France. In 1965, when survivors from 11 countries founded the advocacy organization, the International Ravensbrück Committee, Renée Mirand became its first president. She dedicated herself to this position until her death in 1979, when the cup was donated to the memorial. So much history, so much life, so much feeling and emotion in a material iron enamel cup. It's crazy. This dress also brings out a fair bit of emotions, because when I had photographed this dress, Dr. Sommer and I were doing some publicity in Germany, and the Jewish news came to interview us at our hotel. And I was talking to the journalist. I mentioned I just had come on the memorial, and I had this beautiful photograph done of this dress belonging to Miss Erna van Fries, and I actually took out the print that I had printed and showed them. And both the journalist and the photographer looked at each other and said, "I can't believe it, Richard." And in the issue of the Jewish News the week before, they'd just done a double-page story on Erna, who's now in her 90s, this most beautiful woman, very elegantly kept, completely with it, articulate lady, and her dress. So it was just like, oh my gosh, I can't believe we're both talking about the same person who you met a week ago, who I have not had the pleasure or the honor to meet, but have this part of her history. And the history of this dress is that being half Jewish and being German, um, Irma was imprisoned and sent to Auschwitz with her mother, because she wanted to be kept with her mother and didn't want to be separated from her mother. Her mother, on arrival into Auschwitz in July 43, was sent straight to the gas chambers. 20-year-old Irma was transported in early 43 with other half-Jewish women to Ravensbrück to carry out forced labor at the Siemens factory, which is right next door to the Ravensbrück camp. Irma was liberated on a death march in April 1945. What is so strong and powerful about this image? Yes, we've seen lots of striped dresses and clothes, or pajamas as people call them. But if you look closely, the belt is actually not a belt. It's a handbag strap. And Irma took that off a handbag from the storeroom. And she says it was one of her prized possessions in the camp because she could wrap it around her body, and in the cold, it would give her a little bit of warmth as the dress, the clothing tightened and felt warm around her. And through her time and through the acts of, overwork and malnourishment, you can see she would wind the strap in closer and closer, where it began at the top of the dress, the buckle. It moved closer and closer in to when she was liberated on the death march. That was the size of her waist, which is probably the size of my left leg. I mean, it was crazy to see her journey of malnourishment through the concentration camp system. But she did survive. And she's such, again, I haven't met her, but what I've read and what they told me about her, such a humble soul that when she donated the dress to the memorial, she was really, really embarrassed. She told the curators because she tried a number of times to dry clean the dress to get the dirt and the sand and the muck and the filth out of it, but it just wouldn't come out. And she didn't want to donate the dress in such a state. I mean, that just speaks volumes about the person that she is. The dress is viscose cotton and the belt's made of goat's leather, and it's about 42 by 5 and 16.9 inches, or about 108 centimeters. It's a beautiful story, terrible story. This fork and ladle was found in an attic in Fürstenberg, Havel, which is a city which is very close to Ravensbrück. In fact, Ravensbrück is located within that city along the river there, River Havel. If you can see at the bottom, I'm not sure if you can zoom in, there is a Nazi eagle and swastika at its base, indicating that it was Nazi state property and most likely belonged to an SS officer and their family who worked at the concentration camp itself. The scratches on the fork and ladle were made after the war, most likely by the new owners who found the cutlery in the house and who tried then to scratch off its dark, terrible history, while at the same time, paradoxically, continuing to use it for everyday meals. I don't know about you, but I certainly could not use a Nazi fork and ladle or cutlery, even if I did scratch off the logo to have my evening soup and meal with. It's a terrible legacy of the Nazi past. It was donated by the family in 1993 to the memorial. This Siddur, the next slide, is tiny, absolutely tiny. It's 3 by 3 by 1.8. I mean, it's crazy. We opened it and the writing in there is so small that you need a magnifying glass to view it. It was published in 1901 by publishers Menachem M. Schultz, probably in Warsaw. It came protected in a small little leather case there, as you can see. And the typeface, like I said, is very, very small. It's illegible without magnification. We don't know who it belonged to, but what we do know, it belonged to a Jewish woman who was a prisoner in Ravensbrück, and she smuggled into the camp. And before being transported to Auschwitz until her death, she gave it to a Bulgarian prisoner named Nadia Tanawa. Nadia kept the Siddur until the end of the war. And in 1991, Nadia donated it to the Ravensbrück Memorial. The fate of the original owner, of course, like I said, we assume was murdered on arrival into Auschwitz and is unknown. It's an amazing, amazing Siddur, beautiful, beautiful inside. And the fact that the red is still visible and kept speaks to the quality and workmanship of itself. Okay, the last couple of slides to show you. Evipam natrium. Evipam was developed in 1930 and it was developed by a German pharmacologist called Dr. Helmut Wiesel, who's also the creator of modern intravenous anesthesia. It was considered a brand new, innovative narcotic at the time, and was used by more than 10 million patients at its inception. The German pharmacy company Bayer, that we all know, which is part of the chemical giant IG Farben at the time, manufactured in volume. But during the Holocaust, Bayer and the Nazi doctors found a new use for it. They realized that injected in volume or in large, high doses would kill immediately. So it found a new life in the concentration camp system, where sham medical exams were set up. The prisoners were made to line up outside the medical room where they were marched in. It was mainly used to kill children. When the children were marched in, sat on an examination table, a fake exam was set up, temperature was taken, their chest was listened to, and then the doctor would approach the patient from the left and inject the victim immediately in the heart with EpiPen natrium with a high dose, and would kill the victim instantly, whereby the body was then taken out and either used for medical experiments, autopsy, or was destroyed, burnt. Obviously, these concentration camp infirmaries became killing sites. In Ravensbrück, they even coined a term, Ausspritzen, which was coined meaning through shots, injection, we die. So naturally, the last place a prisoner ever wanted to be was in an infirmary. Bayer gave us permission to take a photograph of that packet. This shoe was very, very interesting. The Nazis considered their biggest enemy, apart from the Jews, socialists and communists, which were very, very high on their list. The prisoners, who brought the fight to them, are the prisoners who basically started World War II, according to the Nazis. This shoe was worn by a French resistant fighter, a communist by the name of Martha Desimo. She smuggled into Ravensbrück with her. And inside her, on that parchment, in handwriting, beautifully written, is the history of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Her comrades Susan Cage and Georgette Cadras would read from this parchment in their huts at night, and during secret clandestine meetings in the evening, to further their political resistance, and to the other women to try and give everybody in their huts some mental nourishment and hope that the fight must be kept up, and they should continue to take the fight of resistance to the Germans inside the camp and do what they can. It was a beautiful object, and then both manuscript and shoe are kept perfectly. It was a crazy find. I didn't want to unwind the parchment because it was quite brittle. I thought about trying to photograph it, but we thought we may damage it by doing so. This very last slide is a doctor's medical kit. And as I mentioned before, infirmaries were the last place that inmates wanted to go. And, there was no help or there was no cure to be found in them, and they were woefully understaffed with little or no qualified medical assistance, and certainly no drugs that would make any difference to you. In 1943, with no medical training, a camp prisoner called Franz Seineck, who was a former electrician, was employed by the SS in Sachsenhausen Infirmary as a radiographer to take x-rays. While working as radiographer and working alongside Jewish prisoners and doctors and nurses, he learned some basic medical skills, and quickly enough earned the respect of his fellow prisoners for his selfless acts of trying to help them with what little medication he had, with what little knowledge he had, and with complete disregard for any consequences to himself, that if he would have been caught, he would have probably been killed straight away by the Germans. Franz did survive Sachsenhausen, and after the war moved to the city with Neuruppin, which is in Brandenburg, Germany. He died in 1976, and in honor and recognition of the work that he did at Sachsenhausen, the city named a street after him. We assume that this medical kit was actually brought in by a Jewish doctor into the camp at some stage. The kit is kept in beautiful condition and is a complete set. So with that, I just want to say, hi, Christy. I just want to say thank you for your time. It's the images you've seen, I hope they've moved you in some way and have made you think about who the owner was and the past that they had, and maybe you could connect on some level with it, and that maybe, change your mind about an object, or change your mind about the perception of what you've thought about the Holocaust, It's created some change in you. It's let you think about it differently through the stories of the victims. And hopefully it'll move you enough to share what you've seen with other people. So please go online, do check it out, visit at the memorial when we can. And I just want to say thank you to everybody. Christy, thank you for having me. And if people have got some questions, I'm ready.
Yeah, so I just want to say thank you so much to Richard, and such incredible insights into the background of the artifacts. Obviously, the photographs themselves are incredible and very moving and emotional, but also to hear the history behind it is, just incredible, for lack of a better word.
Thank you, Christine.
Yeah, so we'll take some questions. So the first question that we have here is, what is the most memorable object that you photographed?
So for me, like I said, it was the bear, because it moved me really emotionally. And, as a son of Holocaust survivors and being brought up in a family that talked about it openly, my wife's family never really talked about it. They're also Holocaust survivors. And having interest in it, driving into the camp every morning to work with Dr. Sommer was quite and Dr. Sommer works there all the time. It was quite an emotional moment just driving into the camp. And Dr. Sommer and I would have this little shtick that we would play to try and desensitize ourselves a little bit. And then we'd set up and then we'd begin work. And then we would just, items we brought in, we'd photograph them, position them. Dr. Sommer would say, oh my gosh, Richard, listen to this story. But when the bear came in and it was open from the box, we both just stopped and said, oh gosh, look at that. And I don't know, because Dr. Sommer himself has a daughter. I have 2 children. And, it was just really emotionally moving. It was like I could connect with it straight away. And I think that's what made it the hardest object for me. For me, it's also the most beautiful image I've taken. And I would love to have it at my house. I really would. And my wife says, no way. So it moves her in different ways too. People are connecting with it differently. Oh my God, it's really strong and powerful. Oh, I could not look at that again. Oh wow, it is so beautifully photographed. I like that. So yeah, that's the one. Followed by the baby dress that you saw, because it's children, and the idea of 1 million children were murdered. Just I can't fathom that number.
Okay, and were there any artifacts that proved more difficult to research?
No, like I said, the Germans kept records of everything, everything. So a lot of it was on microfiche. The memorials themselves have done an amazing job curating their artifacts and taking survivor testimonies and statements when the artifacts were delivered, or researching it themselves through German records, researching backwards. I don't know how they do it or what they've done, but they have amazing records. I mean, they found a dreidel at an execution site called Rosen, which is in Germany, on the body of a person. And I don't know how they did it. And I may be saying the wrong information here. And I'm probably going to get a text from Dr. Sommer shortly for saying, because I know he's listening, the wrong thing. Robert, don't hate me. But somehow they're able to research that this dreidel came from a little town in Hungary, and both these people were on the same transport from the same village to, I think they went to Sachsenhausen, and then one of them went to Ravensbrück, and he gave the dreidel to his friend who stayed at Sachsenhausen, and then he died or was executed on this death march towards the end of the war and thrown in this pit at Rosen, which is near Sachsenhausen. They could trace this dreidel all the way back to this little village in Hungary. I don't know. They just can. It's quite amazing. And like I said, the memorials doing a fantastic job. I mean, it's remarkable. And of course, the people in Germany, they own their past. They own the Holocaust. They don't deny it. I wouldn't say embrace is the right word, but it's there for all to see. It's lovingly done, lovingly restored with dignity and with history.
Well, that probably answers the next question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. So can you tell us more about how you were able to connect the artifacts to the names of the owners?
Yeah, like I said, through records and through human, when the person arrived, their name was taken down, where they came from, what transport they were on. They didn't tattoo, they only tattooed in Auschwitz. But they were given a number on their clothing and their political prisoner status, whether they were a political prisoner, whether they were Jewish, whether they were gay, straight, what political ideology they had, and were treated accordingly. And so all the records were kept and were found after the war. And then those survivors that donated would give their own personal testimony as well. And the records were kept as well in the 70s and 80s. And a lot of survivors did keep testimonies themselves and wrote them down and shared them with their families, had their own collections and records that were then, I would assume, passed to the next generation and then shared with the memorial, both Sachsenhausen and Ravensbrück.
Okay, and then, so the last question. So how does photographing such meaningful objects inform or change your perspective on your own possessions and the legacy you hope to leave for future generations?
It actually is interesting because it changed my. I've always was very interested, like I said, in European history and studies. So it's made me feel that by giving a human voice to something that is just a piece of clothing or an item, and that we've all seen before, to photograph a horrible gas container or shower head is horrible in itself, but doesn't allow a direct connection between you and the viewer. But this allows the viewer to think about what they've seen. And like I said at the end, if you can make your own connection to it, and it creates a thought process in your own mind, and leads you to start thinking about what you've seen and sharing that with others and creating a debate, is amazing. And that's what I love to do. And because of this project, I have to say, and the human story elements, I mean, I can share, I'm very happy to, that I'm working with the CDC in New York, the Center of Disease Control, and I'm working with NYU Langone and Northwell Health out of New York City. And I had an idea that I would love to tell the story of the first responders to September 11. So last year, I've taken a bunch of portraits of the first responders, the men and women that were there on the ground, at ground zero, and telling their stories. And they're coming in to share with me. And I think based upon this work, their experience, complete, unbarred. I'm recording it. We're doing portraits in New York City. I'm working in a studio there. And man, these people are not heroes. They're just they're human beings just doing their job. They hate to be called heroes. And it links back to this, sharing someone's experience through their story. And it's just going to be a portrait, a headshot, but it's them themselves and their emotion and their story on the day that none of us have really heard before, that they were there and what they experienced. So this has led to this most beautiful project, which after COVID, I can get back to New York, hopefully this year, I will finish. And then for the 20th anniversary next year, it'll hopefully it definitely will be on exhibition in the United States and travel the world with a book. So, this project has created a legacy of something else that's extremely meaningful to me that affected, I remember watching that horrible day myself almost 20 years ago. And a legacy that's now affected this work. And I'm working on another project, which again has a human element story to it. So it's creating more stories, more work, more meaning for me in my life that I'm able to share with others. So I'm blessed, absolutely blessed.
Yeah, it sounds like a really interesting project. We'll have to keep an eye out for it.
Yeah, it's lovely, absolutely beautiful. They're beautiful human beings, really are.
Okay, so there's a couple more questions. So how did the stories of the objects and people behind them fit into what you already knew? And did they bring a new discovery to your personal understanding of history and Holocaust history in particular?
It fitted into the framework that I've read around, like I said, from Viktor Frankl and Elie Wiesel and other books and other historians, and what other historians have told me of and other shows. And there's so much documentaries, like you said, Christy, on the perpetrators, but not so much like on the victims. Some books I read around the victims and around the industry behind the killings of the Holocaust. So there were no surprises in terms of what I was hearing about how these people died and or how they survived and what conditions they worked and survived in. What it did is probably reinforce what I'd read and created a confirmation of what I read. by a real voice and another voice or another element to it. And the item itself then just confirmed that, oh, hell, these are people, because you see black and white footage and you see images, but when you connect with them holding these items and that they brought these things with them because they were hoping that this is what they would have left. These were the most important things that they had. They were allowed a suitcase, and this is what they chose to bring. Speaks volumes about, how important they were to them. So it's quite emotional and reinforces everything that I had read.
Okay, and so one of the viewers would like to know if the prints can be obtained somewhere, or is there a book of the work?
There is a book coming. We're in the moment of trying to publish one. COVID's actually allowed me, fun enough, to talk with publishers. We're speaking to one in Germany to print in English and German. That's in the process. Speaking to a publisher in New York actually as well to print, distribute a book. I am talking possibly, with the museum that we were hoping to maybe do smaller prints and sell them. That may still be available. Could make them available online as well. So it's a discussion, I may even have now later on with the museum, and maybe we can sell it on the museum website, and the profits would go to a charity of our choice. Something regarding human rights and human rights issues, I think, would be a nice one to do. But it is a great idea, and yes, we're exploring that. And I'd love to know which one you'd like to buy. Hopefully the bear.
Yeah, well, we definitely have had a lot of interest in the bear. I mean, for good reason. It's a very striking image. So. And then, did the fact that your cousin is Elie Wiesel motivate you to have an interest in the Holocaust at all, would you say?
No, yes and no. Yes, of course, it's in the history, in the blood, it's in the DNA. The fact it was talked about at home wanted me to explore a little bit more. I am a bit of a historian buff, so I'm interested in all history, European history in particular. Fascinates me, and the Holocaust does make up part of that. So yes, I would say that actually Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning, and in particular Primoz Levi, What is a Man, were the bigger influences in my life, because yes, they talk on a mindfulness level, but they also talk about the camps and the camp system. And also Sarah Helm wrote a book on Ravensbrück as well. It's quite a thick tome, but again, another influence on the history of that. I guess it fascinates me around that period, around how people could do this to other people based on an ideology, and that a society can be led so blindly, such an intelligent culture and society, and that we need to take a warning from that and be careful. Because if we're not careful, we can also be led by our politicians down the wrong path. People actually ask me whether, if I see, politically left or right in these images, I'm trying to make a statement. What I see is right and wrong, is what I really do see in them. And I'm trying to tell people, if we don't listen, if we're not careful, and we have done, we can repeat the past.
Okay, well, I think that's it for the questions. So I want to say thank you again to Richard for joining us today. It's been an incredible talk, and hearing about the histories is a great insight, and hopefully people will get an opportunity to come and see the exhibit once we're reopened in the museum.
That'd be great. And thank you, my fellow Aussie, for managing the seminar. It was great. Nice to connect.
Yes, it's nice to hear another Australian accent.
And I hope everybody should stay safe and well, and we'll get through this all together, hopefully soon.
Yes. Thank you again.
Yeah. Thanks, guys. Thank you so much for everyone's time.
Okay. So before we sign off, I just want to let everyone know that while the museum is closed, we will be regularly live streaming programs like this one on Facebook. So this Thursday, April 30th from 7 to 8 p.m. Pacific time, we will be presenting a 1-hour virtual vigil to pay tribute to victims of the Holocaust. And we will share photos of those who perished from the museum's collection and from the personal collections of our community, including survivors, docents, volunteers, board members, and staff. So this 1 hour program is part of the Together We Remember Coalition's 24-hour virtual global vigil, which begins at 8 p.m. Pacific time and on April 29th and ends with our program on April 30th. So the global vigil marks the completion of Genocide Awareness Month and 30 days of virtual events. And then next Tuesday, May 5th at 11 a.m. Pacific time, we will be hosting a talk by Holocaust survivor David Langer. And you can find more information about these events and future events on this Facebook page and also via our website, which is lamoth.org. So thank you, Richard, and thank you everyone for
Thanks,
joining
guys.
us. And everyone be well.
Be well, guys. Thank you again. It was a pleasure.